Everyone, we're looking at e-commerce strategy tonight. I hope you guys are all well, and you've got a nice strong cup of coffee or tea ready for this, because it's going to be one of the biggest documents that you're going to be doing most of this year. Now, there's full of everything that you will have touched across multiple different units. At the same time, this won't touch the complexity of if you actually did this in the real world, but at least you may get some kind of idea of the actual scope of the types of things involved if you were to actually go out and create an e-commerce strategy for a proper business. My guys will need to be creating a full report, because that's what you would do in the real world. You know, if you're going to be creating some kind of strategy, you won't be doing some simple tatty Word document. You know, you're going to need the full works in there. You're going to need cover page, contents page, bibliography. You're going to need to have it well written, so good levels of SPG, appropriately formatted, so none of this stupidly large font, or no use of italics or anything like that. You know, it needs to look the works. Now, Word, very fortunately for you and us, one of the reasons why it is so successful is that, you know, it has a lot of templates, or if you're not going to use a template, you know, there's lots of things that you can do to help you make your document look nicer. So the most basic thing in here is you add a cover page. It'll add a contents page in there for you later on if you've added things like appropriate headers and titles and so on. You know, it will make your life a lot easier. Now, obviously, this is going to require more effort from you guys than what you would usually do for a Word document. C'est la vie, really. You're just going to have to grit and bear it. So this is the type of document that you would be creating in the real world, therefore you're going to be doing it for this document. And if you don't do it, then you'll be doing it again and again until you do it. So let's just start on the actual types of things that you need to include within this document. So you start off always with a client, who is the people or person or company that you are doing this for. Okay, there obviously can be any number of different types of people, because e-commerce is used by a large number of different type of companies. So, you know, it could be a charity, it could be a small business selling shoes, it could be, I don't know, and you name it, really. What is the purpose of the e-commerce strategy? So that may sound really obvious, but ultimately not every company out there is designed to make money. You know, some are out there to inform or entertain. So, you know, what is the purpose of the e-commerce strategy? Who is it aimed at? Again, it may seem quite broad, but you do need to have some kind of target audience in mind when you are creating this thing, because ultimately the broader your target audience is going to be, the frankly more boring your site needs to be, because you're catering for so many different types of people. Actually, in order to make it accessible to loads of different people, you need to make it really quite dull, I suppose you could say. That doesn't mean it doesn't look nice, but you just need to be mindful of the fact that if you are aiming it to loads of different people, then you need to make it, you know, relatively accessible. You know, if you look at all of the websites like BBC, Sky, that sort of thing, or some of the newspaper websites, you know, they have quite a big cross-section for their target audience, so therefore the websites are really quite boring. Whereas if you're looking at, I don't know, let's say a rock band, let's say, I don't know, one of the older types of rock band, then they may have a very different style of website to someone that is trying to sell R&B records, whatever it might be. Okay, but you also need to think about, obviously, who is your client? What do your client do? What type of business are they? How large are they? Okay, you're obviously looking at what purpose of it and who the target audience is. You also need to bear in mind when you're doing this stuff that you're doing it based on what the company wants and not necessarily what you want. You've always got to remember that they potentially will be the ones who are paying you, and therefore if they don't like what you do, then they won't pay you, which is unfortunately the real world. And you may find yourself creating a website that you don't particularly like the look of, but that is the way of it. Now, fortunately, in this actual activity, we haven't actually got, or I haven't got a real life client for you to work with. However, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't kind of work with the premise that there is one there. So you need to talk about components and facilities. So the whole thing about this section is what actual hardware and software are you going to use for this. Now, you looked earlier on in the e-commerce unit about various different types of hardware and software, and now I just want you to be more specific about it. So, have a look at the hardware and software available, and actually choose some. Okay, don't just go, I'm going to have Dreamweaver to make the website on. Actually, that was me kind of. But anyway, don't just say, I want something, like a graphic design editor. Choose, I want Photoshop. Okay, I realise I made a slight error earlier on, but the idea is, basically, if you're going to have a web design editor, what are you going to choose? Okay, so I want you to be quite specific about these things. Obviously, you're not going to be able to mention every single item you have there, because if you do, this document is going to be even bigger than it is before. So I would select maybe 4 or 5 items of hardware and a similar number of software items. And then actually pick them out and say these will be, important things when you're coming to create this e-commerce system. Okay, things that you haven't looked at before will be web hosting. Okay, so you may or may not be familiar with web hosting as a whole. It's basically a company that will give you space on their server to put your files on. Files will commonly be web pages. Okay. Now you'll find that there's hundreds of different web hosts out there, things like GoDaddy and One-on-One and so on, and that they all do various different things. You may find some sites specialize in things like WordPress. WordPress is a series of templates that you can use. It's a content management system, which means that it will help you create and run your website. WordPress is quite a nice bit of kit. ASP.NET is basically active server page. It's a type of server-side scripting language that will make your website do something. So, especially if you're doing things like having mailing lists or something, you may decide to have a website that is based or created in ASP.NET. There are lots of different other things that you can look at. For example, things like JavaScript, things like Ruby on Rails, things like PHP. You can go on and on and on and on. And web hosting is a way of actually saying, okay, my website is going to be made using certain technologies. Which one is going to be best for me? Obviously, you can have various different levels of help, security, functionality based on what company you use, what package you're going to use, and so on. The more you're going to pay, the more stuff you would expect from them. Especially in things like levels of help. Could be things as simple as, is there a live chat available? Or, is there help available 24/7 in case, for example, your website goes down or somebody tries to do a DDoS on it or whatever it might be. Some website hosters will include your domain name with it. So your domain name is the URL, the unique resource locator. It's obviously very important because a website of www.bbc.co.uk, for example, is much easier for you to remember than an IP address, which is ultimately what it actually is, which is a long series of numbers. Or if it is www.godaddy.com/mysite1/website/ I don't know, whatever it might be, but you get the idea. It's much harder for people to remember. If the website name is harder to remember, people will not go there. People will not remember it. People simply will go elsewhere that they can remember. And if you're thinking, oh, well, that's not really fair, just always put yourself in those shoes. If you're a user, what websites would you go to? The ones that you remember, the ones that you trust. And so therefore, everyone else is in this boat. You may also find web hosts will provide options for things such as shopping carts or photo galleries or whatever it might be. You're actually going to need to have a look at some of these items and actually make a choice as to which one you would recommend and why. Obviously, this, depending on the scenario that you've been given, you may want a web host that does a little bit more, whereas you may find yourself, let's say for example, if you have a service-based scenario, then you may find yourself just being able to have a relatively static website where you're not necessarily selling stuff, but that will be entirely dependent on the scenario. Most sites would want to sell something, in my experience, but like I said, it depends entirely on your scenario. You've got advertising. Now, this obviously is linked to an earlier video that we've done. You'll need to think about how the website will be promoted. Some of the best examples of advertising in recent years have been for websites. So, for example, you've got the Meerkat, Alexander, I forget his name. But anyway, the fact that when you think about comparison websites, you have compare the Meerkat, compare the market, or you have the Welsh guy who's selling Go Compare, which was really annoying, and I can't actually remember his name right now. But the fact that I can remember those two says a lot about those type of adverts. You'll need to think about how you would go about promoting your website, because actually the likelihood is that the scenario that you've been given won't be able to afford to go out and pay for those TV ads. So how would you go about and do it? Okay, there's a number of relatively straightforward methods to promote your website, starting with things like SEO. But you would obviously stay clear of the ones which have a bad reputation, such as spamming at the minute. However, that's going to be ultimately your call. Payment system is going to be very important. So how are you going to take money for your products? So if you are selling stuff, most companies will want to sell something. You're going to have to think about how you will do this. So examples will include things like Barclaycard, who work with things like credit cards. They're not actually, I know they contain the name of Barclays, but they're not. They're a different department of it. You may want to think about if you have a scenario which includes a brick and click store. So in other words, you have a online store and a physical store. You might want to think about getting Barclaycard, because Barclaycard could work in the physical store as well. You have two more common things that are used these days, such as PayPal and Circle. PayPal is extremely popular these days, and Circle is growing. These guys will process transactions and commonly take a cut. So you'll want to have a look at how much the cut would be, and also things like cash out times. So when people pay you money, it's usually there quite quickly. However, in terms of how quickly the money goes from that particular account, so for example the PayPal account to your bank account, may depend on things such as the size of the transaction. It may depend on things like when you're doing it. So for example, if you do it at the weekend, will you get it quite quickly? Things like who are you cashing out to? Are you buying stuff rather than are you putting it straight into your bank account? Things to consider. Also things like, important things like security and so on. So PayPal wouldn't be as popular as what it is if it wasn't fairly secure. However, I'm sure there are examples of fraud and security issues with it somewhere down the line, especially for the bigger companies. So something else to obviously consider: costs. Okay, e-commerce companies and strategies traditionally have a very high upfront cost. So in a lot of assignments that I've read over the course of years, they generally correctly say that e-commerce over the longer run is cheaper. However, certainly upfront e-commerce is more expensive, and the reason obviously is that you need to spend money in order to build your e-commerce system. Web developers are quite expensive. Equipment is quite expensive, and you'll find that the cost probably exceeds that of a physical store, at least initially. You also need to spend a lot of money getting the marketing out there. because actually it's not as natural for people to see your products online as it would be, for example, if your store is in the high street. If the store is in the high street, you naturally have people walking past that store every day. Whereas if your store is online, people are actually going to have to go out of their way to find the store, at least until your name has built up. So, what costs are you going to have initially? And you have to think about the size of your company and whether or not your company can actually ride these costs. So, the bigger companies probably spend millions on this, but they can afford to do that. Whereas some of the smaller ones can't afford the initial outlay of a few £1,000s. But it does depend a lot on the business. You'll also need to do some web design. Now, when I say web design, it is entirely design. There isn't the requirement for you to build a web page here. Okay, so you'll need to do a basic design spec. So when you actually come to do your web design unit, which is due to be, whenever it might be, you are required to do quite a detailed design spec. Okay. However, for this unit, a basic design specification is fine for me. Excuse me. And I'm looking for you to be talking about things like color schemes. I'm looking for you to be talking about font styles, potential content that you could have inside your website, which includes things like videos, sound, maybe some games, whatever it might be. So, you're just kind of highlighting these. And you also have to think about, don't just list random colors there, because if your color scheme is, I don't know, a bright fluorescent pink on brown, then that'll look horrendous. And that's something that I would refer you for, because you clearly wouldn't have thought about it. With things like font styles, students, in my experience, can sometimes pick some wacky fonts for use on the web, and it's frankly bizarre, because you are attempting to appeal to the widest range of people possible. You need them to read your text. You don't need them to sit there going, "What on earth is that?" And also, you need to bear in mind that the end user will only be able to see fonts that they have installed on their machine. So if you have downloaded a specific font for your website, the likelihood is that the other people watching it won't have that font installed. And therefore, they'll just refer to the normal font installed in their browser, which is probably something like Arial. So, generally you want to be relatively sensible with this. Okay, the web hierarchy is where you think about how the end user actually navigates through your website. And you always assume that your end user will land on the index or homepage. And this thing is set out a bit like a family tree. So it's like you start on the homepage, and then you potentially navigate to any one of generally 3 or 4 pages, maybe a bit more if you've got a larger site. And like I said, it's set out a bit like a family tree. I've seen all sorts of different styles of web hierarchies down the years, and ultimately it should only ever look like a family tree. And I don't really know why people try to do weird and wonderful things with it, but either way, if it doesn't look suitable, again, it will come back to you. You need to do some wireframes. Now, in the actual web design unit later on, or earlier on, you might have already done it, you would need to do wireframes for every single page of your website. However, in this unit, I'm only looking for the one wireframe for the front page of your website. Okay, and you just need to think of a wireframe as an allocation of space. Okay, because there is no real point creating a design for a web page which is full of content. It just makes no sense, because most web pages these days are changing the content all the time. Say, for example, you go onto a news website, the way the page looks is generally quite similar every time you go on it, but the actual content of that news site changes pretty much every time. And so therefore you design a wireframe, and you say, okay, well, my main story will go here, I'll have my logo up here, I'll have the navigation bar going across the top of the site, wherever you might have it, and you just kind of allocate space of these sorts of things. You wouldn't actually say exactly what goes where. Now, I've done actual specific videos for those things, because like I said, it is part of the web design unit, and you'll need to do it in more depth from the web design unit, but there's no point me going into massive depth on them here when I've done it elsewhere. So I would encourage you to watch those, to actually have a look at things like, what does the web hierarchy look like, what does the wireframe look like, and go from there. So for your e-commerce strategy, you will need to address all of those things. Okay, you will need to include every item that we've just gone across or gone through. Okay, and it's going to be quite a big document. You may find that you do things like the wireframes in another piece of software. So, for example, there are lots of websites out there, such as wireframe.cc or Mockingbird. Mockingbird. That will help you design it, and then you import the image later on. But that's ultimately going to be up to you. I will not accept wireframes that are done in things like PowerPoint, because PowerPoint is not meant for that purpose. PowerPoint is a presentation piece of software, and you are just being lazy if you do that. Okay, so like I said, this document is going to be quite big. It's going to be probably double digits in terms of length, I would have thought. I guess we'll see, just how in depth you go with this. And you're going to need all of the items for the full report that I mentioned earlier. You're going to need to get cracking on it, but hopefully that has helped. Please remember to subscribe, so when I do more videos you'll get the updates quicker, which means you should be able to do better work and so on. And I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you. Bye bye.